Welcome to the webinar. This is the first part of a series on changing the conversation. Part 1 today will be on strategies for business in a world of uncertainty. My name is Priscilla Charles, and first I'd like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will start in a few moments and will be hosted by Robert Sarver, Director of Solutions Architecture at Vistatec. We will be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So in order to ask questions to Robert today, simply go to your GoToWebinar panel on your screen, and about halfway down, you'll see a questions box. Simply type your question here, and we'll do our best to answer them in our Q&A. If you're joining us today here live, thanks very much indeed for your time. And if you're listening to this recording, thanks for listening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Robert Sarver.
Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to our attendees in Europe. As Priscilla mentioned, this is the first of a three-part series that we call Changing the Conversation. It's a webinar series designed to look at some internationally focused topics that are timely and interesting and which are relevant to doing business in the 21st century. Today's topic is about strategies for business in a world of uncertainty. As everyone is aware, there's been a lot of maneuvering and activity in global trade and politics over the past few years. Many of our customers are facing hard choices about issues such as Brexit, tariffs, supply chains, and the like. We are now experiencing the reality of that old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. The goal of today's presentation is to provide some background on the existing system, help you understand some of the reasons for the dissatisfaction with it, and then describe some strategies that businesses have chosen for how to manage risk in this brave new world. Your hosts from the Vistatec site are myself, Robert Sarver, Director of Solutions, and Priscilla Charles, our Communications Director. I'm based in Seattle, while Priscilla is based in Dublin, Ireland. And just a reminder, at the conclusion of this webinar, we'll present you with some contact points to reach out to both of us. So after a quick background and dash of advertising, we'll proceed to the core material itself. Here's our agenda: introduction, advertising, pillars of the existing global trading regime, the successes and the unraveling, how that landscape is changing, and then we're going to talk about 7 coping strategies for businesses for dealing with this uncertainty. A little bit about myself. I am a graduate of the University of Washington in 1986, Seattle University as well, the Defense Language Institute. I have about 30 years in this business, with about half of it at a large company, Microsoft. I've also worked for a medium-sized company and some smaller companies and some .coms. In my current role, I'm Director of Solutions Architecture for the Americas. And here's my contact info in case you'd like to reach out to me in email or see me on LinkedIn. Hello, we're Vistatec. We are a unique and innovative localization supplier based in Dublin, Ireland. We provide services such as localization, quality review, transcreation, market research, SEO, and engineering and testing. And incidentally, the role of transcreation in marketing will be the topic of our next webinar in this series, coming sometime in April. And the third installment of these webinars will be on one of our consultancy services, the value of market research in making decisions about market entry. And that session is scheduled for the month of May. At Vistatec, we like to say, your vision, our commitment. We take the time to understand our customers and the passions they have for their products and services, what their opportunities are, what challenges they may be facing. And then once we understand that, we use our expert teams to help bring this passion to market. So we really focus on your vision first and make it our own. So I would like to start this with a quote. Patrick Collison, one of the co-founders of Stripe. Stripe was the brainchild of 2 Irish brothers from the rural part of Ireland back in 2010. They created a software plugin that businesses could use to streamline online e-commerce payments, connect instantly with credit card and banking systems to send and receive payments. It was literally 7 lines of code that revolutionized the electronic payment system globally. It was a hit. Businesses such as Lyft, Facebook, DoorDash, and thousands of other smaller startups that aspired to be like them turned Stripe into the financial backbone of their operations. So in 2010, Patrick was really sort of bullish on the global economy. He thought the world was headed toward ever-increasing globalization, economic stability, interdependence. This is from a recent Bloomberg interview where let's just have a look at what Patrick's saying now. Now, based on the events of the last couple of years, no one holds so Panglossian a view. That's a one world view. There are more headwinds to global economic integration than there were at any time in the past 20 years. That's going to make global expansion more difficult for businesses in general. This is a theme that sort of permeates this presentation, but it's also something that we're hearing over again, echoing from our customers and our prospective clients. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think are the 5 pillars of the current global trading system. There are other ones that play a role, Mercosur and Latin America, but I think from a global point of view, these are probably the top 5. The first one being the European Union, the second one, the North American Free Trade Association, the third, the World Trade Organization, also known as the WTO, the fourth one, the International Monetary Fund, and the fifth one, the World Bank. Some of these were founded as part of Bretton Woods, and some of these fall underneath the larger umbrella organization of the UN.
Robert, now if I interrupt you, hey, you mentioned Bretton Woods in your 5th point. Can you explain what that was exactly?
Sure. So at the end of World War II, 1945, as it was pretty obvious that the Allies were going to win, the Allies met at a resort in upstate New York called Bretton Woods. The goal of this meeting was to try to design a global economic and political system that would keep these world wars from happening. They got into a room and looked around at each other and said, listen, guys, twice in 40 years, the countries in Europe have taken the planet to the edge of extinction, because of international trade or because of military alliances or colonial properties. Once Europe gets into a war, they wind up dragging the rest of the planet in. Let's design a system that avoids that. And so what came out of that were things like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and several other principles of global commerce.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robert.
Okay. So the pillar I want to talk about now is the European Union. This is essentially, in the words of Churchill, the United States of Europe. It has multiple predecessors: the European Coal and Steel Community, European Atomic Agency, the European Economic Community, also called the EEC. The EU is an umbrella organization for all of these. It was formally declared by the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. The key takeaway from this, though, is that the EU is primarily, it's an economic union without centralized political authority, and this has been both its strength as well as its weakness. Now you can see from the map here that we've got Britain out here off on the left, here, kind of standing by itself. Britain has always been kind of the outsider in the EU. There's a feeling of not really being a continental European country. It's an island nation, a sense of its own empire. And so I want to play for you now a clip from a 1970s British comedy called Yes Minister. It's the story of a fictitious British cabinet minister who is constantly trying to get his policies passed, and he's being blocked at every turn by civil servants. And at this point in history, the EU was called the EEC. The clip is almost 40 years old, but it shows some of the British thinking and misgivings about the EU, and we're seeing echoes of that now in the Brexit debate. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, pokes fun at some of the UK's neighbors, but I think it would be worth a listen. So now let's listen to Sir Humphrey Appleby explaining why Britain entered the EEC.
Yes, right. This directive comes from Brussels, saying that all EEC members must conform to some niggling European word processing standards. The have to agree to the plans of masses of European word processing committees at the forthcoming European Word Processing Conference in Brussels. Oh, say something.
Yes, Minister.
Quite so. Is that all you want to say?
Well, Minister, I'm afraid that is the penalty we have to pay for trying to pretend that we're Europeans. Believe me, I fully understand your hostility to Europe.
I'm not like you, Humphrey. I'm pro-Europe. I'm just anti-Brussels. I sometimes think you're anti-Europe and pro-Brussels.
Oh, Minister, I'm neither pro nor anti anything. I'm merely a humble vessel into which ministers pour the fruits of their deliberations. But it could well be argued that given the absurdity of the whole European idea, that Brussels is in fact doing its best to defend the indefensible and to make the unworkable work.
That is simply not true. I know it sounds pompous, but the European idea is our best hope of avoiding narrow national self-interest.
That doesn't sound pompous, Minister. Merely inaccurate.
Listen, humble vessel. Europe is a community of nations, dedicated towards one goal.
Oh.
Maybe show the joke.
Oh, Minister. Let's look at this objectively. It is a game played for national interests and always was. Why do you suppose we went into it?
To strengthen the brotherhood of free Western nations.
Really? We went in to screw the French by splitting them off from the Germans.
Why did the French go into it then?
Well, to protect their inefficient farmers from commercial competition.
That certainly doesn't apply to the Germans.
No, they went in to cleanse themselves of genocide and apply for readmission to the human race.
That's such appalling cynicism. Well, at least the small nations didn't go into it for selfish reasons.
Really? Luxembourg's in it for the perks. The capital of the EEC, all that foreign money pouring in.
Very sensible central location.
With the administration in Brussels and the Parliament in Strasbourg, Minister, it's like having the House of Commons in Swindon and the civil service in Kettering.
If this were true, why would the other nations have been trying to get in?
Such as?
Well, take the Greeks.
Actually, I find it difficult to take the Greeks. Open-minded as I am about foreigners, as you both well know. But what will they want out of it? An olive mountain and a red cedar lake.
I just don't accept any of this.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Minister. I suppose some of your best friends are Greeks.
No, very good. The trouble with Brussels is not internationalism, it's too much bureaucracy.
But the bureaucracy is a consequence of the internationalism. Why else would there be an English commissioner with a French director general immediately below him and an Italian chef de division reporting to the Frenchman and so on down the line?
I agree.
It's like the Tower of Babel.
I agree.
No, it's even worse. It's like the United Nations.
I agree. Perhaps, if I may interject, you are in fact in agreement.
No, we're not.
Brussels is a shambles. You know what they say about the average common market official. He has the organising ability of the Italians, the flexibility of the Germans, and the modesty of the French. And that's topped up by the imagination of the Belgians, the generosity of the Dutch, and the intelligence of the Irish. Oh, gravy train. They live on champagne and caviar, chauffeur-driven Mercedes, private aeroplanes. Every one of those officials has got his snout in the trough. Most of them have got their two front trotters in as well.
Oh, Minister, I beg to differ. Brussels is full of busy, hard-working public servants who have to endure a lot of exhausting travel and tedious entertainment.
Terribly tedious, working their way through all that smoked salmon, forcing back all that champagne.
Well, in any case, Minister, I think you're blaming the wrong people. Yes, Minister.
This directive comes from Brussels, saying...
Alrighty then, so a little bit of humor there, a little bit of poking fun, but also a window into the British mindset about the EU. The next of the 5 pillars I want to talk about is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was an agreement that eliminated most tariffs on trade between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, went into effect in 1994. The goal obviously was to spur trade between the continent's 3 largest economies. Numerous tariffs, particularly those related to agriculture, textile, and automobiles, were gradually phased out between 1994 and about 2008. The next pillar I'd like to talk about is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. This essentially is the body that sets the global rules of trade. Its purpose is to facilitate the free flow of trade as much as possible, because going back now to Bretton Woods, the belief was that it was trade barriers and restrictions which contributed significantly to World War I, the Great Depression, and then World War II. The WTO as a body provides three things: a negotiation forum for creating agreements and trade treaties, a set of rules to provide predictive behavior and standards, and failing those two, a dispute resolution process when all else fails and when companies or countries cannot agree, they have a forum to bring their grievances. Now, the WTO also has a set of regular meetings called rounds, Tokyo Round, the Uruguay Round. These are forums for updating rules and hearing suggestions about new scopes of power. The next pillar is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF, their primary purpose is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, exchange rates, international payments, all the grease that allows commerce to actually happen. So mentally, you can sort of consider this to be a global version of the Federal Reserve. And lastly, the World Bank. This is a global funding and lending agency. The primary difference between the IMF and the World Bank is in their purpose and function. The IMF, as we mentioned, exists primarily to stabilize exchange rates, while the World Bank's goal is actually to reduce poverty. And to that end, they have funded over 12,000 development projects around the world using traditional loans, interest-free credits, and outright grants. So we've talked a little bit about the history. We've discussed the steps taken at Bretton Woods. You now understand what sort of the 5 pillars underpinning the global system are. At this point, the logical question is, how well has it worked? Well, over the last 75 years, since about the end of World War II, we've had unprecedented stability in the global system. It's been very predictable, and businesses love a stable, predictable landscape. We've had a trade conflict resolution process. International growth and development has exploded like no time before in recorded history. Consumers have benefited, global poverty is down, and many deadly diseases are now in retreat. So all in all, not a bad job. But having said that, not everything is sunshine and roses. So coming out of the last about 10 or 15 years, there are some themes that are essentially our dissatisfaction with the global trading regime. The benefits of this system have not been evenly dispersed. Guarantees put in place to protect worker rights, environmental protections have been ignored in the pursuit of profit. China has been a significant violator in the WTO. However, having said that, cheating occurs overall. There is a feeling of betrayal. Global elites have sold out the common working families. They're sitting in dark rooms, working on whiteboards, re-architecting economies and governments to generate as much profit for themselves while not really caring about the knock-off consequences. Corporations have become the super individual of the 21st century. So it's corporations and not the individual citizen that have become the dominant recipients of the benefits of this globalization process. As manufacturing wanes in the West and is replaced by a service-based economy, large sections of Western workers are feeling left behind or being made obsolete as the economy changes gear at a speed which is too fast for them to keep up with. Western countries continue to dominate this international global process and system, receiving most of the benefits, and they act with impunity in trading and tariff forums. It's notable that in this international system, farming and textiles were not covered by global trade agreements. This is important because in the developing world, farming and textiles are 2 of the most important export industries.
Now, Robert, speaking of manufacturers, are most of these targeting industries in manufacturing? And are there any service industries also impacted as well?
So yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of industries that are affected here. There's pure manufacturing, but there's also other industries like energy, software, and we also tend to think of this in sort of a manufacturing versus services clear, clean lines between those two areas. But other areas such as shipping, like trucks and freight hauling, those are actually considered to be service industries, even though they are sort of a blue collar job. So whether it's white collar or blue collar, whether it's manufacturing or services, we're so globally integrated now that everybody's feeling this to one extent or another.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about service industry, so thanks for clarifying this.
Yeah. So we've talked about these pillars of the global trading regime. Let's do a health checkup and see how things are going right now. In the European Union, the EU is facing a migrant crisis as a knockoff effect of the wars in the Mideast and in Syria. Far-right parties have captured a significant number of seats in many national parliaments. Brexit, as everybody who's paid attention any time in the last year and a half, Brexit is consuming the UK at the moment. There's another one waiting in the wings, a potential Greek exit from the EU called Grexit. President Trump and the EC Commissioner Juncker had a meeting in the U.S. In the middle of a tariff war over steel, but the meeting turned out to be just a meeting to think about having a deal. But those steel tariffs are still in place. NAFTA, the USMCA, we do have final agreement on a version 2.0, but the details are scarce, and those that we do have suggest that this may simply be window dressing. There hasn't been a lot of movement on actual changes of quality. It's more declare victory and go home. Trump has announced that he intends to withdraw from NAFTA. This sets in motion a 6-month clock. And this agreement still needs to be approved by a Democratic House of Representatives here in the USA. The WTO, as I mentioned earlier, this is organized by rounds, Tokyo round, or Uruguay round. The last round was the Doha round, and that was in 2001. That forum was never officially closed, that is formally ended, because it collapsed in disagreement. Now the USA is threatening to pull out of the WTO entirely. And what we're seeing is bilateral and multilateral agreements taking the place. So at this point, a lot of smart people are looking at this and asking, is this going to be the end of the WTO? The IMF and the World Bank both have been accused of not being transparent, overriding national central banks, requiring countries to make currency reforms, or imposing strict policies in order to obtain loans. And some of their functions are being eclipsed by large central banks, in this case the People's Bank of China, using development dollars to fund initiatives that are actually in their own national interest. You may have heard about the One Belt, One Road initiative that China has launched with countries that used to be part of the Silk Road. I added a 6th one here, which is new, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This would have been sort of a NAFTA for the East Asia rim of countries, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, most notably China, and the USA. But the USA pulled out of the TPP negotiations. That didn't stop it, though. 7 nations went forward, ratified the TPP back in October of last year. So this is a summary of sort of how things are changing. In the past, economically, we had commerce defined by global trading agreements. We had an active dispute resolution process and relatively free flow of capital and talent. We had a robust global banking system that ensured liquidity and stable currencies and provided a financing mechanism for developing countries. From a political standpoint, we had a stable world order, roughly that is governed by Western-style democracies, providing some level of leadership. Western democratic and liberal values, what we call human rights, assumed to be true. And generally speaking, we had rule of law and government by the legislative process. And that's the past. The future, however, is looking a little different. Economically speaking, we have commerce defined by trading blocks or bilateral treaties, one country to another country. We're lacking a universally agreed dispute resolution process. We have significantly more restrictions on capital and talent, and multiple banks and schemes for developing countries to fund their public works projects. Politically, we've seen a wave of nationalism. United States, Canada, Europe, even in places where you might not expect it, such as South Korea and Japan. We now kind of have a multipolar world where there's no clear leader. And internationally, there's far less consensus about what constitutes civil or political rights. And finally, we're seeing a return of what I call sort of the military strongman for life model of national governance. This is something we also saw in the 20s and 30s with Hitler and Tojo, Franco, Mussolini. So the world is changing. So at this point, it's kind of a natural question to ask, how long could this system, this interruption endure? How long could it last? The global trading system is undergoing change. The result could be bad for many people in businesses. So at the core of it, the question is free trade normal? Or have the past few decades that we've enjoyed, have they just been an aberration? And what if free trade is the rare exception and the world just cannot get back to how things used to be? This brings us to John Nash, who entered the imagination of the public from a movie called A Beautiful Mind, played by Russell Crowe. Now I'm going to play you a clip here that sort of unpacks a concept that he created called the Nash Equilibrium. I'm not going to play the entire clip, but I do want to play a portion to explain the concept and why we may be in for a long ride.
This is Marketplace. I'm Kai Risdal. Let us review for just a moment here the progression of the Sino-American trade war. Earlier this year, the United States put tariffs on solar panels and dishwashers from China and other countries, to be sure. Then it was steel and aluminum, also China and other countries. Now, though, thanks to the Trump administration's focus on Beijing, it is taxing fully half of everything that we buy from China. All of that has led to retaliatory tariffs from China and other countries on our exports, agriculture mostly. The whole thing happened so fast, you might reasonably conclude we could get out of it just as fast. But as Marketplace's.com reports, game theory suggests otherwise.
Game theory is a way scientists and mathematicians think about human behavior and interaction. What should I do based on what you do? Should I trust you? And what do I do if you break that trust? Before this trade war, the US and China had some trust. Both were members of a free trade club known as the World Trade Organization. And then trust broke down. Trade professor Jennifer Hillman at Georgetown Law says a decade ago, Beijing began requiring U.S. companies there to hand over their secrets.
Their forced technology transfer violates the commitments China made when it joined the WTO, that its level of IP theft is a violation of the intellectual property provisions.
Washington, meanwhile, broke trust by taxing Chinese imports this year.
Under the WTO rules, the United States is not allowed to unilaterally just ratchet up the tariffs on China.
Game theory suggests a couple things. One is it's hard to establish trust when it's broken. And two, a trade war is actually a rational thing for countries to do. It's in their self-interest. Here's how. NYU business prof Arun Sundararajan says the U.S. interest is to tax Chinese imports, whether Beijing responds or not. Either way, Washington makes money.
If China imposes tariffs, the US's best response is to say, well, we're going to tax your imports as well. If China doesn't, then the best response of the US is also to say, well, they're not doing anything. Let me sort of collect from them.
Now, if you think game theory is just a theory, you're taking on Nobel economist John Nash. He helped to develop this. Nash entered the popular imagination in 2001 when Russell Crowe played him in the movie A Beautiful Mind.
I had a truly original idea. That's the only way I'll ever distinguish myself. It's the only way that I'll ever.
Martin,
He came up with something called the Nash Equilibrium, which suggests that a trade war of self-interest is actually the norm, and that cooperation and free trade is the exception.
Both countries imposing tariffs is the Nash equilibrium of the game.
Jacinda Ardern, this means a trade war could go on a while, as in 10 years. Now, game theory does allow for things to get shaken up, but it takes something dramatic to disrupt things, say political change.
Could be the election of a new president in the United States. Now, that unfortunately has to be coupled with a similar willingness to negotiate on China's part.
All right, I think we'll stop it there. But again, the takeaway here is that this may be the new normal. And so companies that are expecting to sort of just get back to business as usual may have a long time to wait. So at this point, having given this lecture in the past, I'm often asked, well, isn't this a little overblown? Are you overstating it? Is it a little too pessimistic? And my response to that is, many American businesses don't seem to think so. This is a graph from Bloomberg that shows the number of American companies that have already started thinking about responses to the trade war. Some of them are working on shifting supply chains, others are raising prices, and we're going to talk about some of these strategies shortly. But the key element here is that these are smart companies. They can read the tea leaves just like anybody else can. And if this number of companies are considering making adjustments to how they do business, then it's clearly something that they're taking seriously.
Now, Robert, obviously there's a lot of economic uncertainty, as you mentioned. Do you see any trends or patterns from how companies are responding to this uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as we go through these 7 strategies, what I'm seeing is that consumer durables tend to be clustering around a particular strategy, that is raising prices. Car manufacturers tend to be clustering around certain other strategies, cost cutting and distributing their supply chains. So and to be clear, these strategies are not exclusive. Some of them are practicing 4 or 5 strategies at the same time, depending upon who their supply chain partner is or who their market is. So, but yeah, there are patterns emerging here, and I think that it's valuable to sort of find a company that is close to your own business vertical and see what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so yeah, but business must go on. Economics climates, they come and go. So here we have 7 suggested coping strategies. I've organized this in order of least disruptive, least expensive, time-consuming, to the most disruptive, expensive, and time-consuming. I'm going to list one representative company that has chosen each strategy. And as with everything in life, all suggestions have upsides as well as downsides. So, absorb the losses. If you think the expected financial hit is small or temporary in nature, it may just be beneficial to simply absorb the hit and reduce your margins. Business goes on as usual. Your customers love you. They don't feel any pain. Of course, the downside is that your margins are going to suffer, and your ability to absorb the losses may be temporary and finite in nature. So you may only be forestalling the inevitable bad news. So here's Tyson. They make chicken. They are a massive producer of a consumer good, and telling their investors on a recent call that they don't think they can raise prices. They're just simply going to have to take smaller margins because they're unable to actually move that price point. Trim your costs. Cut overhead costs wherever you can. Look at your supply chain for cost savings. Double check your margins. Substitute, switch out existing materials if at all possible. The upside is you may be able to lower your costs while keeping your sell price the same. The downside, of course, is that you probably already have a pretty efficient supply chain process. You may have already squeezed all of the the waste out of it, and your own supply chain partners may be impacted by the tariffs as well, so they may be unable to give you back anything. So here's General Motors. They're actually pursuing multiple strategies. This is one of them. Cost cutting, squeezing their own supply chain, postponing purchases until some future year or financial quarter. Raise prices while communicating with clients. If you're in a situation where you have to raise prices, sometimes it's better just to have that hard conversation up front. Assure your customers that you value their business. Customers will often, they'll appreciate this approach even though they don't like it. Of course, they may also push back. They may seek other suppliers, or they may want you to do some kind of sharing where you take half the hit and they take the other half. So here's Electrolux, a Swedish manufacturer of quality vacuum cleaners, telling their investors that we are going to actually raise prices. We believe we can do this because of the perception in the market of our product as a quality brand. Maximize your home market. While you're waiting for things to sort themselves out internationally, just bide your time and focus on growing your domestic market for consumers. Upsides, the one market won't be hit by tariffs is your domestic market. And in reality, if we took a hard look at it, most companies haven't maximized the full potential of their domestic market anyhow. The downside, of course, is that if you're an extremely export-dependent business, this option may not help you very much. So here's the Korean car manufacturer Hyundai, very popular in their home market. So for them, the home market strategy is a very good one. Look for other markets. Consider going into other geographic markets that are not impacted by the tariffs. So several companies in China, Jinan Star Fastener, the Tongming Group here, Chengsu City Parts Factory, they manufacture nuts and bolts. They were kicked out of Europe due to dumping violations and the global recession. They started looking for markets in the USA. Now they're being hit by the China tariffs, so they're going back to Europe, and they're also pushing part of their manufacturing off to Singapore. And about this strategy itself, this is probably already on the going out and looking for other markets, probably on the radar of a lot of companies already. So this simply may be the kick in the pants that is needed to sort of bring forward this strategy by a few months or a few years. Open offices in multiple geographies. So depending upon how the tariffs are written, you may be able to evade them if you can establish a legitimate business presence in a particular country or inside a country that's a member of a particular trading bloc. This particular approach, though, as you can see, is starting to ramp up on the cost and the complexity. And it does require a deep understanding of the present and proposed tariff regulations. I mentioned earlier that U.S. car manufacturers are kind of clustering around this. They're opening production centers in the USA to make sure that they're part of NAFTA or whatever comes after. There are production centers in the EU to make sure that they capture access to that market, and also in China for the same reason. This of course has lots of costs: the real estate costs, regulatory, HR costs, and really important if you decide to follow this strategy. It has to be a real, sincere effort. If local authorities suspect that you've opened an office in their country as a sham to evade the tariffs, you may not actually evade them at all, and you may also run afoul of local laws. I will say also that one of the benefits of this particular strategy is that a lot of customers appreciate doing business with a multinational that sees their home market as being important enough to open an office there. So the last strategy I want to talk about is the most difficult and the most expensive: globally distributing your supply chain. This is exactly what it says: develop a multi-source strategy for your products and services. So you'll be able to ship your products to almost all countries and avoid tariffs. It also creates redundancy in your supply chain in case of delivery issues, natural disasters, earthquakes, riots, anything that would interrupt the flow of products and services. The downsides, of course, are significant. Investigating and developing a new supply chain can be a costly, multi-year undertaking. And the more complex the skill of product, the harder it may be to replicate your supply chain. It's a rare skill. Global supply chain management is really hard to find, and even large corporations have failed at it. So just kind of keep that in mind. Looking at Panasonic here, we notice Panasonic in the West, the rest of the world, it's Matsushita. They have distributed their supply chain over multiple geographies, and so they're well positioned to be able to weather this storm. So I'm going to hand you back to Priscilla now in case there are any questions. Here's our contact information.
Thanks, Robert. That was a great presentation, so thanks very much for that. We have a number of questions, and the first question I would have for you is, you've spoken about the last 75 years. Do you see global manufacturing changes impacting trade? For instance, areas such as robotics and AI, but also, are there any challenges or opportunities for global trade?
So that's an outstanding question. There's a lot of parts to it. So I think the questioner has put his or her finger on something here. Every problem is also an opportunity. So I think one of the outcomes of this is that companies that provide products and services are going to have an added incentive to look globally, to sort of get them out of their comfort zone of just working in the USA or just working in France or just working in Brazil. There will be a greater emphasis on sort of building a truly global market for your product and services, as well as a supply chain to support it. I want to say something about sort of the non-material services, though: software, AI, finances, things which occur in the digital space. These can still be impacted by tariff and trade wars. The financial sector, for example, which is banking and mortgage and life insurance and stuff, they're still sort of subject to these tariff laws. So you know, part of it is the geography, part of it is the business that you're in. So you know, as you're looking for these potential new opportunities, you kind of have to keep both, you know, what you're selling and where you're selling it to. You know, you have to keep both sides of that coin in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for clarifying this. I have another question for you, this time about a very hot topic that you might have heard of, Brexit, in Europe and across the world. And there's a lot of unknown about international trade. So do you have any views or opinions on this?
So I was actually just in Ireland last month, and I spent some time both in the Republic and also in the UK and in Northern Ireland. And my observation, and this is just speaking as an American, is that there's a lot of sort of tension there. There is this concern over where's the border going to be. You know, if there is a full-on Brexit, is it going to be the existing border between the Republic of Ireland and the north? Is it going to be in the Irish Sea, you know, out in the water? And Northern Ireland is feeling like a football being kicked back and forth from the EU to the UK. And so there's a lot of very nervous people over there. There are farmers over there that own land on both sides of the Irish border. They run cattle in the Republic and they run cattle in the north, you know, because they're, you know, they do milk or they do cheese or whatever, and they're concerned about whether can I go back and forth across to my two properties. If there is a hard border there, then you're talking about checkpoint. You're talking about walls, and then the Irish start to get really nervous about that because they've had 20 years of peace since the 1998 Good Friday Accords. For 21 years now, there's been no hard border. There's been no men with guns. There's been no barbed wire. The former troubles of Northern Ireland are greatly reduced now. But if you put a hard border back in there, all that could come flying back. One of the things that I heard a lot while I was in Ireland was, the possibility of reunification. Maybe the North and the South will actually reunify as a result of Brexit. I don't know that that's going to happen. In my mind, I still think it's a long shot. But I know that 20 years ago or 30 years ago, that wasn't even on the table. And here you have, this possibility coming out of the woodwork where, because of the trouble caused by Brexit, the UK might even lose Northern Ireland as part of its union. At this point, I think we're all hoping for a solution that preserves, a peaceful border and also allows the people in the UK to find their best destiny.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, Ireland is very much part of the EU, European Union, and the market. So yeah, it is quite a complex topic. I do have a last question for you. You spoke about game theory as the new normal, and you said that companies that expect to go back to business as usual have a long time to wait. So can you expand a little bit on that, please, for us?
So what game theory says formally is that that you reach a point called the Nash Equilibrium, which means that no one actor acting on his own or her own can make any change that benefits themselves. So you're kind of stuck in a status quo where nothing you do, no action you take on your own by yourself results in any kind of advantage to you. So every time you make a move, somebody counters with another move, and the system resets back to how it used to be. It's like this eternal chess game where every time you make a move, somebody else counters with it. Every time you take a piece, somebody else takes a piece. And so you always wind up back with the same number of pieces and the same score that you had. The only way out of this is, as the audio clip mentioned, is having an external force that actually offers a new option. You can have an alliance of 2 or 3 players that, acting in concert, can make a move that actually does create some kind of an advantage, or you can have a change in the political or economic systems internally, such as a change of government, or which would bring about a different point of view. But it's if you go back even to the founding of the United States, for the first 150 years or so of the USA's existence, we funded all of our federal government through tariffs, import duties, and taxes on international trade. There was almost no taxation in the country of actual U.S. citizens. So this idea of international trade being a source of income for via the tariff and taxation process, it's been around for thousands of years. The Romans used to do it. So it's always sort of been the default fallback scenario, which is what I said earlier. Maybe free trade. Maybe it's just been this golden era that came once and isn't going to come again for a long, long time.
Thanks for that, Robert. Yes, who knows? So now for our audience, if we didn't get the opportunity to answer your question today, of course, we'll endeavor to answer all of them after the webinar. And of course, if you want to go back and listen to part 1 of the webinar, today's audio recording, it is available on the Vistatec.com website. And sorry, our recording will be available, of course, in the coming days. So now I think I'll hand you over to Robert for a quick summary.
Alrighty then, thank you, Priscilla. So thanks everybody for listening. Hopefully it's been interesting, maybe a little bit of eye-opening. Today I hope you've learned something about the key organizations that underpin the global economic framework for the last 75 years or so. You have a better understanding of some of the successes and failures of that system. have an appreciation for the forces working to remake it, both the political and economic landscapes, and why they might be around for a while. And finally, understand some of the strategies for how to conduct business in this ever-changing economic and political environment. And just a quick plug here, part 2, looking forward to having part 2 with you as an audience. That will be the role of transcreation in international marketing, and look for an announcement on that for some time in the month of April.
Thanks so much, Robert. That was really interesting, and thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for being with us today. So this webinar has now come to a close.